iti whānau, welcome to Raw Politics, Newsroom's weekly podcast where we cover the three big P's in Parliament: policy, politics and the people. We have a bit of a slimmed down team for you on the Raw Politics episode today. It is me, political editor Laura Walters, and joining me in Auckland is Newsroom co-editor Tim Murphy. Hello, Tim. We are the dream team.
Hello, team. Hi, Laura, and welcome back to you from your time away reporting on the American election. What a fabulous, but now seemingly far away time that was, given the double kind of dose of major history we've had in the New Zealand Parliament this week. So wonderful to have you back for that and to have you here. Thank you.
No, thank you. I was trying to say we are the dream team. I muddled all of that up. I was going to say we're just like this government. We've been cutting the waste, which I can say because Marc and Sam are not here. Of course, they are overseas now. I'm back here, as you say, and Marc is in Azerbaijan for the big climate summit COP, and we've got Sam over in Lima in Peru for APEC. So a lot going on around the world at the moment. Cool. Now, today on Raw Politics, I feel like we've covered these topics a lot, but we're going to do it again because that's really all anyone was talking about. First up, we'll have the Treaty Principles Bill. Of course, this controversial, high-profile bill had its first reading in Parliament on Thursday. And earlier in the week, we saw the national apology offered to abuse and care survivors. And then, as always, to wrap up, we will offer you some recommendations. As we've mentioned, the Treaty Principles Bill had its first reading in Parliament on Thursday. There has been a lot of discussion about this bill, which of course came out of the coalition agreement between the National Party and the ACT Party. But we have finally seen it. While people are walking from the far north down to Parliament as part of a nationwide hikoi, we saw parliamentarians come together in the House to debate this bill. It was a pretty fiery debate as well, wasn't it, Tim? We had haka, we had two MPs who were kicked out of the House, one of them named, which of course is a very serious thing to happen. And all round, we just had a very fiery debate that did show a lot of division in the House. Now, I've been around here for a while and I haven't seen anything like this before, Tim, but you have a few years on me. Have you seen something like this before? The haka, the disruptions, the name-calling, the suspensions. Is this unprecedented?
Well, it was pretty new to me. I don't know that I've seen an MP named in the House, but I might not have been looking at a particular time in the last decades, but certainly rare. And it was also a lot of heat, a little bit of light, and I think it'd be interesting for us to perhaps examine what light came out of that brief time. It was only, less than an hour probably when it was put together of that first reading debate. It is performative, I think, that David Seymour, introducing the bill, cut himself as a statesman, calling upon some of the great freedoms of history and civilization, and sort of broad principles of equality and so on from other jurisdictions as well, to just paint this as a needed straightening up of a New Zealand that has lost itself in terms of equality of opportunity and principles. The other end of it, the Māori Party, look, this goes to the heart of everything they stand for their people. And so they needed to be distinct and unique in their response from the Greens, from Labour, from the other government parties that also oppose it. So I thought both kind of performed as they needed to at a milestone moment.
And that's the thing, isn't it? We were discussing this yesterday and what New Zealanders would think of this, watching it from home. And while, the majority of middle New Zealand might look at it and just kind of throw their hands up and think it's all ridiculous, to those bases on the edges, on both edges, that Te Pāti Māori and the ACT Party are playing to, it will work well for them. As you said, ACT will see David Seymour, who sat there calmly, quietly put forward what might seem like, some pretty rational ideas around equality, around giving the country a chance to discuss this very important document and the principles that underpin it. And then on the other side, Te Pāti Māori's base, many of who are marching around the country at the moment will see that fierce opposition, saw that they fought for what they believed in and were willing to, have their youngest MP ejected from the House, named suspended for 24 hours, meaning that her vote on the bill doesn't count or that she can't vote on the bill. They would see that as well as being something they would want their representatives to do. So on both ends, the parties played well to their bases, I thought. And I'm interested as well, Tim, in your thoughts on how the Speaker of the House handled it. I mean, he did not look impressed when Hana Rafiti Maipi-Clark stood up and began that haka. She tore the bill in two. She started kamate and she was joined by those in the public gallery as well as others on the opposition benches. Jerry, I was watching back on the video, he rolls his eyes and then he pursed his lips and he waited throughout the haka, but at the end of the second round of kamate, he cleared the gallery, cleared the public gallery, which again is quite unprecedented, suspended the House and then called everyone back. I mean, do you think that was the right approach to take by the Speaker?
Ultimately, yes. I think they needed to get some order into things. It was hugely highly charged. And, you need to just call a pause. I think a lot of this, though, is in the context of a speaker who hasn't really been on top of expectations and discipline, if you like, of this House and Chamber for quite a while. Too many people on all sides, all parties, get away with too much disregard of the chair, of the standing orders, of any etiquette, probably, that used to be. And so in a way, I think he just stands a bit of a victim of his own laxity. But once, the haka started, there was no sort of over-calling it, no matter what his microphone did. And so the only option was to stand, wait, and then, yes, to try and get some peace into the equation.
I was just going to say, Tim, speaking around that, the decorum of Parliament, the Speaker throughout question time and then throughout the debate, even leading up to that, on multiple occasions he had given, a final warning. And there are only so many final warnings he could give. And you could tell that people just thought, this was too important or they cared too deeply about this to listen, but it also, like you say, speaks to the control or the respect that he commands in the House. What I thought was very interesting as well was there was loud applause. There was actually a standing ovation at one point from the public gallery, and the Speaker made it clear that was not appropriate, that people in the gallery could watch the proceedings in the House, but they were to do so in silence and without, intimidating or impacting what was going on in the House. And so then everyone in the public gallery moved from, a loud and audible applause to, silent applause. And we saw these arms go up and up even higher in some situations. So, for many people, and I think the context of earlier in the week, where we heard from people who had their language or their reo stripped from them, when we're talking about the national apology and those who were put into care, many of these, almost everyone in that public gallery yesterday was Māori. They're used to, they carry this, trauma, I guess, in some instances from the state of being told to be quiet, but they found another way to have their voice heard as well. In the same way that Hana stood up at the beginning of the debate and asked for a speaking slot. She asked that Te Pāti Māori be given another 5-minute speaking slot. She was told no. And I took part of potentially what she did after with the haka and her decision to lead that on behalf of Te Pāti Māori is potentially a bit of a pushback against being told, no, you will not speak on this. And it was, fair that she would be told no, that there are already speaking slots that have been set down. But the fact that she pushed back in this way and thought, well, I will be heard in some sense. If it's not through a speech, then it's through a haka. I just thought it was quite interesting there.
One of the other optics, if you like, out of this whole thing to me was that when she started and when the Māori Party leaders stood up and their party stood up, then the Greens and quite a few of Labour standing, probably most of Labour standing, not all participating, but it was a very strong, maybe one of the earliest representations of those three parties united as opposition. And on the other side, the speeches, and we'll talk about that in a moment, that national MPs gave, New Zealand First to a lesser extent, but the national participation showed a disunited government trio of parties, which again, they've been pretty good, haven't they, in sticking on the same page generally. There's been little dissent between three parties. So you had this kind of visually and well, orderly show of what might lie ahead in terms of, not just on this bill, but perhaps on other things in a working way. So yes, I thought that was interesting out of it.
Yeah, and you mentioned, Tim, the difference in the speeches and what happened there with the National Party, obviously, and New Zealand First speaking against the bill itself, what it stands for, what David Seymour looks to achieve with his bill, or what he aims to fix in his mind. National and New Zealand First, while neither of them I thought were overly passionate speeches, they did lay out their reasons for why they do not support the bill, because begrudgingly, they have signed this coalition agreement to see it through first reading and through the select committee process. But those people that stood up, ministers who stood up on the government side from National and New Zealand First, you're right, they had a very different take than their coalition partner, David Seymour. Now, David Seymour was asked about this in Parliament. He said, well, we're not fighting in public. This does not speak to a coalition that is divided. We agree on the vast majority of things, and where we have differences, we have differences. We've been open about that. We've discussed it. We've worked our way through it. But like you say, the optics of that were quite stark. And I also thought an interesting thing to note on the government side was not only was the Prime Minister not there, and of course the Prime Minister's never there on a Thursday. He often doesn't speak on bills or legislation. He's not the sponsoring minister. But for something this big, the fact that he was well away from it, I think you just have to note. Tama Pōtaka, the Minister for Crown Māori Relations and Māori Development, was not in the House, did not speak on the bill. Shane Reti, another senior Māori minister, was not in the House, did not speak on the bill. Winston Peters, of course, was also out of the country, and Shane Jones, who would often speak on a bill like this for New Zealand First. He was not there again. They threw it to Casey Costello, as they do with so many things at the moment, to carry that for New Zealand First. So I think it was as notable who wasn't there as much as who was there.
And on the national speakers, so there were three, I think, and to me, it was interesting that they were speaking off very, very similar, almost scripted talking points, and the same ones that the Prime Minister, before he left to leave Parliament to go to Auckland, I guess, to go to Peru, those talking points were so similar. And it struck me that National had made a conscious decision to push back quite hard on this day, not against ACT, but against these ideas, and against this as a solution in search of a problem, or an answer in search of a question in some ways. They talked about, we don't think it's right, we don't think one simple, and they all use simplistic and simple, solution can achieve this, that we're addressing things measure by measure. And yes, we believe there are some issues in race and treaty-based provisions in law and in practice that need addressing, but we're doing them one by one. And that's a progressive view, and that's what National, over time, they said, has done in the past. And they tried to sort of talk up that National has been a reasonable and centrist and progressive force in treaty matters in the last generations, and they have some reason to argue that. But, of course, it comes down to, well, if all of that is so, why was it so important in those coalition agreement? We know all that. We know why. They've signed up to it and so on. I think your point, you made, Laura, in your piece about it, that while they have agreed in the coalition agreement to forward this bill to first reading, or at least to select committee, they didn't actually in the coalition agreement sanction or commit to a 6-month period of select committee hearings. So that is something that could have been some variability on, and they could have tightened that and shortened the division that the PM sees it bringing, that David Seymour doesn't see it bringing, or perhaps now he does see it bringing. I think that's another interesting point. There are some variabilities there. They're not committed for good to those aspects of things, as they weren't committed to the timing of Thursday to do it. They could have done that when the Prime Minister was here and when Winston Peters was here, had they chosen. They control that. So I think, for National, it was of importance to them to perhaps push back harder, and all of these things for all of these parties will be cognizant of polls and where their people are seeing their party and what they need to do. And it may well be that there was a bit of a hurry up for National. You need now to start putting your side of this so that, the ACT machine on this didn't take over. And remembering all the way along that 92% of the vote represented in Parliament doesn't go for this bill. 8% does. And so they will be seeing that and knowing, even though David Seymour will say there are polls and a lot of the supporters of it will say the vast majority of the silent majority of New Zealand do support this. We don't know that, but what we do know is that party didn't get more than 8%, and that these ideas aren't supported by the other 92%. So politics comes into it completely, of course.
Yeah, and you mentioned there the select committee process, Tim. I think it's important for us to think about what comes next, because we saw this explosion in the House on Thursday afternoon, but this is just the beginning. Not in the coalition agreement, but behind closed doors and discussions, David Seymour has secured a 6-month select committee process. And how that runs, how people push back against that, those who oppose the bill push back against that, will be really important to watch. I think there's a lot of pressure right now on James Meagher, the National Party MP, who is chair of the Justice Select Committee, and deciding with his committee and with others how they hear this. Will they travel it around the country, as they have done for some other bills where there are a lot of people who want to be heard? Will they stay in Parliament? Who will they agree to hear? Will they hear members of the public? Will they just hear experts? Will they mostly, just take on written submissions and hear a few people? Will they try and hear a lot? Will there be extra security? Will they be strict in terms of the speaking slots and the lengths and things like that? We've seen this protest of the haka in the House. We also have seen in a recent select committee on, and now I forget which bill, but I think it was the Crown Minerals bill, someone basically doing a protest select committee submission. You'll remember the man who was dancing in the floodwaters in Dunedin while he gave his submission. Are they prepared for things like that? Are they prepared for disruption in Parliament? We also, of course, at the same time have the hikoi running that will be coming to Parliament next Tuesday. There's been a lot of speculation that is potentially why the first reading of this bill, the timing was changed. What impact is that going to have? How are those people going to organise through the select committee process? I understand that while there will be some people engaging with that process, there might be plans to run a parallel select committee process outside of Parliament, hear people outside of these walls. So all of that, how it's managed, how heated that gets, what happens over the next 6 months, will be important to follow, but will also really set the mood. And I think we'll find out once and for all if we can have what David Seymour says, this mature kind of academic debate on the principles of the treaty, or whether it will potentially, cut our country down the middle.
And perhaps just to finish up, putting the drama and the high emotion and the deeply felt reactions aside for a moment, if you boil it down, it's a hugely complex question this is trying to answer. But it's trying to answer it in what National has kept saying is a simplistic way. And that usually doesn't hold. It would be like trying to define what are the values of our justice system. To define open justice in 7 words or something, for example, and freedom, let's define freedom and this sort of thing. Some of these things aren't able to be encapsulated in sound bites and headings. The other thing about it is that Act's communication of this, I think, while representing feelings that they have picked up from people that Māori have too much influence or are accorded too much space and privilege, they try to say it in a way that is in their full-page ad that appeared in the papers Friday morning, which said, the first point says, any New Zealand child born today ought to have the same rights. But nowhere in that ad or in their communications or in David Seymour's speeches have they outlined what rights some child born today might have that another child doesn't. And I think it's not rights, actually. It's perhaps redress and policies that try and rebalance past injustice and past inequity. There's certainly that. No one can deny that some policies and practices are to lift up and balance those who society till now has said needs that. But in terms of rights, I just think that's a big, big statement without a whole lot of detail and without actually probably representing what some of the feeling that ACT is trying to respond to is actually saying.
Right, now moving on to our second topic today after that very in-depth discussion. Thank you, Tim. Another meaty topic. Of course, on Tuesday we saw the Prime Minister, the heads of our public services and the leader of the opposition all offer an apology to those who have been abused, neglected and tortured while they were in the care of the state and faith-based institutions. We've talked about this issue before, Tim, on Raw Politics, both the abuse, neglect and torture itself and the Royal Commission that dug into that, as well as the second scandal, I think, as you've so eloquently put it in the past around the state's cover-up, them seeking to minimise cover-up and fight back against survivors so that they don't have their voices heard and have that redress. And on Tuesday we heard the Prime Minister and the Crown, the representatives of the Crown, apologise for all of that. Now, let's just start by having a look at those apologies. Tim, what did you make of them? Did they hit the right tone?
I think the political apologies from Luxon and Hipkins both did. They did what they had to do. I did point out in a piece I wrote that Luxon, unlike Hipkins, did not mention his own political party, National, in terms of apology, whereas Hipkins was willing and obviously decided to put Labour right in there and apologised on behalf of Labour people and Labour representatives and governments. But that apart, in broad terms, I think they both did what they needed to do, which was to accept the wrong, acknowledge those who were present and those who had passed, and to promise not to let it go like that again, even in the legal response and redress, that they need to move quickly and need to set aside the obstacles. Having said that, the apologies from the public service chiefs, which preceded the actual hearing in the chamber, those apologies, I think, were received probably a bit more cynically by some of those present, and in particular, of course, the Solicitor General, who runs Crown Law, who personally had been involved in cases, major cases, pivotal cases along the way, and whose team or personal legal actions had been under scrutiny in the Royal Commission. That was received very poorly, and I think there was almost, to use a legal term, as our reporter did, contempt for her presence and what she was saying.
And that was so, Tim, I just wanted to jump in there to paint a bit of a picture for our listeners, for those who didn't watch these apologies. I mean, when the Solicitor General offered her apology, there was constant yelling, there was constant, heckling puts it too lightly. Like you say, the word contempt, but people were shouting over her. They were, telling her to sit down. They were telling her to resign. They were calling her a liar. At one point, a waiata broke out and she had to pause what she was saying. And then she was had to face a media scrum afterwards to again answer those questions as to why she is not listening to survivors' calls to step down. So, just wanted to paint a bit of a picture there of what she faced.
Yeah, thank you. And look, it wasn't just their concern, I think, and what was expected of her wasn't just looking back. It's now looking forward, and as the government makes pretty broad and committed promises to put things right in terms of redress and in terms of how government agencies interact, they're hamstrung somewhat, and you've written about this, Laura, by the fact that they're relying on legal advice from Crown law, which really, at the moment, is seen as, the kind of the outfit that was central to that second phase of scandal. So that's sort of left the government's effort a bit hamstrung. And it's not just Crown law, they're taking advice as well from ministries, obviously Ministry of Justice and others. And those people too involve some people, and even the cross-departmental new organisation, the person put in charge of that has had an involvement in the past at the UN talking about these issues for New Zealand. So I think looking forward, it's difficult territory and it's difficult for the government to unpick it, but they probably need to be able to get credibility and to be able to move fast and to be able to have trust and faith in what they're hearing internally.
Absolutely, Tim. That issue around advice kept coming up, and Erica Stanford at one point did say, yes, I've sought advice from others outside of Crown law, given how they have been implicated by the Royal Commission, but the others outside Crown law were the Crown Response Office with those same officials that you pointed to. And the question of independence and people who are not essentially tainted by what has happened thus far kept coming up and has come up with survivors that I've spoken to since Tuesday's apology. They have called all along, and the Royal Commission, of course, also recommends an independent redress system that sits outside of these government departments. At the moment, they have rapid payments through, the Ministry of Social Development and others. There's payments and redress schemes that also sit within the Ministry for Health and the Ministry for Education. But these, of course, are the ministries that were in charge of the institutions that abused them and treated them so horrifically and have continued to since, in the way that they have minimised and silenced and pushed back against survivors. So this idea that there needs to be independence, from those ministries, especially in terms of this broader redress scheme that is being designed at the moment, is something that survivors are really, really focused on. Then the question of redress, of course, is the big one that kept coming up in the lead up to Tuesday. It came up on the day and has come up again since. There was a design group of survivors that put forward a high-level plan, basically, for what redress or an independent redress system could look like. Now, that design group has been disbanded, and there seems to be the plan for redress kind of stalled at some point. Not much happened under Labour. The National Party came in. They said that they're moving, at pace, as they always do, but nothing. They wanted to announce something on the day, and they didn't have anything major to announce. And there have been questions as to what is the hold up there. Is it the costings? Is it, political issues between the coalition parties? That has been suggested that there could be some hold ups there, that different parties want different things. Is it how the entire system itself is designed, because of course it's not just the financial payout, it's also, designing the right way for survivors to interact with that system. And then part of redress is what happens now in our state care system. How do we change it or reform it going forwards? And so all of these things seem incredibly complex and seem to be holding up the government being able to announce anything. But survivors have said that there are two non-negotiables for survivors when we're talking about redress going forwards. One is that it has to be independent for all of those reasons that you've covered, Tim. And the second is that it needs to have survivor voices involved. So that survivor design group has been disbanded, like I said, but talking to Erica Stanford this week, she said that she's very keen to pull together some kind of new survivor advisory group, essentially, to work with them on redress and making sure that it also has rangatahi voices in there, so that young people at the moment who have experience of the current care system, they can speak to that going forwards. So those are their two non-negotiables, and this will be a space to watch to see how quickly the government can push forwards, because at the moment when they give these apologies and they table the report, it seems like there's a lot of urgency and a lot of momentum, but I don't know, what do you think? Do you think they'll hold on to that momentum, or will it peter out?
I think there's a real risk here politically that the longer they take, the less they'll do, and the less impetus there will be to do. Already after Tuesday's apology, I noticed there's been a sort of a trend of commentary from voters, social media people, others, members of the public, basically victim blaming and turning it now to, okay, what do these people want? Was it actually their home life that was at fault that led them to being in care, where it was at fault? Sort of all this backwards retrospective kind of arguing now. And the longer that goes on, and New Zealanders and others can be a mean people in some of these instances where they can turn on the survivors and the victims of things. So I think the longer Erica Stanford and the government take, the more that percolates into some of the political discussion as well, and the parties around, and the more that people will forget the powerful emotion of the Royal Commission and of the Apology Day, and of those survivors that we saw, and of the waiata, and of the unity that was spoken on the day, and things start to fracture. So I think it could easily peter out, Laura, and not a lot gets done. I mean, I think what the government came up with for the day, in a practical sense, was pretty lame. And I know, they'll say, well, they did what they could, but some of the actual things that went into a law that was introduced that day, they were aspects that the Royal Commission hadn't even recommended. They were just kind of things that when they looked at state care and youth justice, they thought those would be good to have.
Low-hanging fruit, wasn't it, Tim?
Yes, low-hanging fruit. These were measures that were sort of probably being looked at for other reasons, and they were able to line them up, and they got four together in Cabinet and said, right, that'll do. That's an omnibus bill. And I'm sorry to be so cynical, but really, they weren't matters that were central to what we're talking about. They might help some kids in care now, good, yes. But, these were sort of easier measures that could be brought together in a hurry.
Yeah, it's what you announce when you don't have anything to announce. And it's goes without saying, I think, that they wanted to announce a redress scheme and they're not there yet. So they need to keep pushing at pace on that compensation, and also on reforming the care system as recommended by the Royal Commission. Let's wrap up today's episode with some recommendations. Something, Tim, that you have watched, read or listened to this week. What have you got for us?
Well, something hopefully a bit lighter, because we've been, for the last half hour, in some pretty serious and deep waters. Mine is an ABC America news report. It's not so much their writing of it, it's what it's about. It's about the satirical online site, The Onion, over there, having bid for and won the assets, the name, site, and the database of the crazy InfoWars site, which is a far, far right site run by Alex Jones, who lost it because of a court case taken by the parents of victims of the Sandy Hook massacre, when he denied that Sandy Hook had occurred and put blame elsewhere. He lost big time. The Onion has moved in and scooped up the assets, no doubt, to put them out of their misery for good.
Yeah, I had a chuckle when I saw that one too. Now, my recommendation for this week, Tim, is a piece that you have written on Newsroom. It was an article about the Speaker of the House's decision to ban our reporter, Aaron Smale, from coming to Parliament to cover that national apology on Tuesday, and then his reversal of that ban. Of course, this was covered by us and other media on the day, but I think that the story itself, what it stood for, and then the response that came from it is incredibly important. So great reporting there.
And can I just chip in on that? That after that decision was made, and when Aaron was and did come to the Parliament for that apology, the Prime Minister said a couple of times that there were wider issues about his behaviour. It's nonsense. There weren't. There may have been their concerns about things, but they weren't legitimate in our view, and they were more about being tackled and grilled, dispassionately and forcefully, but the behaviour issue is just something they've put out there to try and cover what was a very poor attempt to keep a exacting journalist out of the frame.
That is it from Raw Politics for this week. We will be back next week, of course, with our mates, hopefully in a special international episode, patching in Marc from Azerbaijan and potentially even Sam talking about what has happened at APEC. So watch this space. Let's see if the technology will be our friend with that one. Of course, as always, a big thank you to our producer, Dave Filoi-Ali'i, and to our readers, listeners and viewers. If you have any burning thoughts, hot takes, reckons, send them my way. You can get in touch with me at laura.walters@newsroom.co.nz. You can find us here next week on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.